I see now with the introduction of large language models and their ability to.
Hello and welcome everyone to the next episode of the AIM Media House podcast Simulated Reality. Today we have with us the co-founder and CEO of Gramner, Anand S. Anand, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thanks, Kashyap. Doing well. Cooking at the moment, actually. I'm not sure you had many guests who've been cooking while having a podcast, but yeah, that's what I'm up to right now.
Is it? Oh, now I am hungry, but that's fantastic. I think we are off to a start on a good note. Uh, so today, while you cook, we are going to talk about large language models and a very important aspect of it, which is trust, which is also needed in cooking, by the way. But uh, so. What is it? So you said you wanted to talk about this topic, right? Let's start with why do you wanted to? Why is this subject close to your heart, and what is the reason behind why you wanted to talk? And then maybe we can delve deeper into the topic.
See, the last time I was this excited by any technology was in '98 when I tried out Google as a search engine. The transformation for me at that point was a change from I need to learn stuff to I no longer need to learn stuff. I can look up practically anything. And that is a huge leap. So I changed my perspective at that point to say, I don't really need to know where stuff is. I don't need to memorize things. I don't need to build up a knowledge base. I can focus instead on analysis, on figuring out how to do stuff. What I see now with the introduction of large language models and their ability to think, so to speak, is that now they can do the analysis. I don't have to figure out how to do stuff anymore. That's something that they're good at, and they're improving at a rate faster than almost anything that I've seen. Which means that my job is completely changed. I no longer need to know how to do stuff. I need to figure out what to do. Asking questions has become far more important now, and how to ask and what questions to ask are the biggest changes. On a day-to-day basis, it's completely changed the way in which I'm approaching things. I have pretty much stopped coding by myself. It's invariably pair programming with a language model. I have stopped researching by myself. I instead ask a language model to summarize anything that I'm researching. I've stopped ideating or brainstorming by myself. I invariably ask a language model to brainstorm with me. It's almost like I've suddenly hired half a dozen assistants, and they are interacting and working with me on a variety of topics. My only problem is now my imagination. So I, among other things, wanted to talk about this topic, if nothing else, to prompt my imagination to go beyond what I'm used to and see how I can leverage the power of LLMs.
Correct. And so that's interesting, right? You 1998 you said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost more than 20 years, right? 25 years. And so you said you're very excited about this technology after 25 years, but the aspect of it which you wanted to talk about was trust. Why is
Okay.
that? Why is that so important?
Technology used to be the realm of reliability. Used to be that you write a piece of code, it does exactly what you tell it to do. You may be giving the computer wrong instructions, in which case you have created the bug and it's throwing out an error, and you've got to debug what mistake you've made. By and large, the computer doesn't make that kind of mistake. It's just following instructions. Of course, things have evolved to the point where we no longer really understand the interplay in software. So it almost starts feeling like the computer is untrustworthy, that it's making a mistake, not us. But with deep learning, and particularly with language models, where we are beginning to control systems not through something as structured as code, but rather through something fairly amorphous as English. The way in which we take a lot of technology reliability for granted is now going for a toss. I can no longer believe earlier. I'd search on Google, and by and large, if it was a source like a newspaper, I might believe it. At least the credibility of the newspaper is something I know how to evaluate, but I'm not concerned about Google's reliability as an intermediary. Today, with a large language model, I'm not sure what I can trust. What kinds of mistakes is it likely to make? Why is it likely to make those mistakes? All of that is opaque. And because this is a completely different way of thinking about computers in general and technology in general, I figured that's something we should talk about today.
Sorry, but what essentially makes large language model? Like, what are some of the features or factors of it that make large language model difficult to trust? You said technologies before had an element of trust or an element of, they didn't make you uncomfortable, right? To use. What is that? The one thing for sure is that the impact, the scale at which it can impact is very high, especially not just LLMs, but overall any intelligent technologies from AI to general AI. But what is it about LLMs, especially, that kind of make it so scary, and that we need to address it at the very start?
You're right. Scale is definitely one thing. If you take Google Maps, for instance, people have driven into lakes just because Google Maps was giving them the wrong direction. I myself have found wandering near the bed of a lake, taking a taxi, just in some really bizarre path that I've never been before. The taxi driver's never been before, but we both trust Google Maps and we just go ahead.
But to be fair, I think that that's a fault. If you're reaching up to the lake, that's okay. If you're reaching driving into it, I think that there the human intelligence is also at fault.
I agree. And yet, the fact that it happens, right? You know, it's so easy to trust something that is consistently right. And I mean, like, it's just a human element. I mean, how many people would believe that a parent would strangle a child? And yet some do. And then you say, well, is it the fault of the child to have trusted parents naively? Similarly, a technology that leads you in the right direction, even unexpectedly, 9 times out of 10. So you say, look, there's no way this route is right. And Google Maps actually proves to be right 9 times out of 10. The 10th time it proves wrong. Even if I go into the middle of the lake, the next time I am going to follow Google Maps. It works. And that is the thing about scale, that it works so often and so ubiquitously that the standards just need to be higher. So that, you're right, is certainly one aspect of this. But the second thing that I wouldn't say worries me, but sort of, yeah, keeps me cautious is how LLMs work in general. It's basically take a word and try and guess what the next word might be. And then take those two words and try and guess what the third word might be. That's literally what an LLM is doing, word after word. In the process, it also doesn't deterministically pick the next word. You ask the same question. Next time, it may pick a different set of words to continue from there at any point. And that's part of the model parameters. You can choose how much randomness you want. And a certain higher degree of randomness leads to a creative model. Lower degree of randomness leads to a more precise model. But in any case, what you can't avoid and don't even want to avoid is randomness. But if there is randomness and there is true randomness, then that means A, there's less reproducibility, and B, there's less predictability. I can't be sure that it'll say the same thing again. I can't be sure that I will be able to tell what it's going to say next time. If, let's say, a Mars rover were being driven by a large language model, I would trust it about as much as I would trust another human being. Could work, but I don't know what could go wrong.
So considering that there is, so we're talking about the scale, right? The scale at which we want to trust the LLM. And one of the things that you mentioned is, so the topic that we wanted to talk about is how far can an individual trust LLM, right? Is there a way to measure it? If yes, how? If no, then how do we kind of put a framework around it? and how do we address this as a bigger question?
I have no idea. Can we measure it? I hope so. But how? Absolutely no idea. And the thing about this is that it's not because we don't have frameworks of trust, it's that our understanding of what constitutes trust in itself is pretty amorphous. Let's take a lie detector test. If someone passes a lie detector test, then would we say they are trustworthy? Well, there are two ways of looking at it. One is to say, well, yes, because they've passed the test. The other is to say, hold on, why did they have to be subject to a lie detector test in the first place? Meaning, uh, if somebody had been through a lie detector test, there's enough smoke that I would worry about that person in the first place. And that's one part of the kind of gray area we are at. But if we do start building models around trust, then it's quite likely that they would be very domain specific. For example, if I have a language model that's trained on, let's say, um, having read medical journals, then I could give it a test saying, can you correctly answer a set of abstract questions around medical technology, maybe? Models have been tested on IQ. But again, it's an open question whether IQ constitutes trust or is something else.
Or ethics? Yeah, yeah.
So, what is trustworthy itself remains an open question. And that, I think, will lead us to more narrowly define what we mean by trust in specific instances and then solve for those problems, maybe, rather than in a general way.
Yeah, I think this is the first time technologists, I've seen technologists talk about ethical values at that extent, right? I don't think we have talked about, we always have to an extent, like especially with different technologies that have built, but this is the highest that, we, or at least I have observed when values like trust and other ethical values, respect, fairness, bias, all of these kind of come into play, and we are having this conversation. And one of the funny things is there's no way to measure it. And one of the other ironical part is technologists, especially data professionals, are very data driven and they like to measure things while doing that, right? With that context, right, one of the things I believe is that there is a higher need of collaboration between people, social science professionals, social scientists working in ethics and technology that understand trust, as well as technologists that understand, that are building the technology. But apart from that, right, what is your view on how we can, while these are difficult to measure, these concepts are difficult to measure, what is your opinion of how we can enable more trust and more fairness around algorithms? Let's not go to fairness because I think that's a whole another this thing. But how do you enable trust among this, and how do you enable that literacy, technology literacy around communities that enables this trust, right?
How do we build trust in a model? I think a good way of thinking about a model, at least a large language model, is the way you would treat a smart friend who's read up all of Wikipedia. How would one evaluate such a person? Well, firstly, you would ask whether they're able to answer a reasonable number of questions right. Second, you'd see if those answers are verifiably right. And you'd also see if there are ways by which you can answer questions in a way that is more likely to lead to useful answers. Let's take examples. So I asked on Monday evening when the India-Pakistan match was going on, who is likely to win the India-Pakistan match? And ChatGPT did a search, and it came back with an answer that was equivocal. Said, given the current situation, even though India scored 356 runs and rain has stopped the play, the match could go either way. At which point, I have an answer that is unlikely to be wrong. It's saying, I don't know. I mean, how wrong could that be? But is not necessarily useful. So my next question or next statement was, look, you are confident. Go ahead and make a prediction. At which point it did. It said, in that case, I think there is a good chance that India will win because there have been, according to my database, only 3 instances where a country has scored more than 350 runs and has still lost the match. So India seems to be placed well. And it also offered to do a search to see if the total statistics of matches that where a country has scored over 350 and still lost, and found only 8 such. Now, this is one of those cases where my lack of trust comes not because it's saying something that's wrong, but it's refusing to say something that might be wrong. Trust goes in both directions. I do want it to stick out its neck and say how much it's sticking its neck out. The second
Got it.
is that I can nudge these models to behave in certain ways. I can say you are confident and it will answer more confidently. I can say reason out your steps and it will be able to reason out those steps. So a part of it is evaluation for us to have a point of view on whether the model's output is likely to be right or wrong. A second is for us to know how to tell the model to improve its result. The third, on top of that, is aggregation over time to see how often it gets something right, what it gets right, and build a mental model based on that. One particular way in which this could be accelerated, I'd say, is having bots with different personalities. If I had, for example, a critical bot that in general distrusts something, and I have a researcher bot, I get the two bots to talk to each other. The critical bot is likely to take that information and throw back possible errors. Have you considered X? Have you considered Y? And so on. Which the researcher bot can then go back, check, find evidence, show it to the critical bot, which can then poke further holes, which the researcher bot can then further address. At the end of the process, when you have either or even a separate bot summarize the conversation, you will be able to find the set of issues that it has been able to resolve and a set of open issues that are still unresolved and get a more holistic perspective of this. So I believe that we're not too far from a situation where we can use different bots with different personalities conversing between themselves to get something that is more trustworthy than any one bot with one personality can be.
Got it. Got it. And in terms of so while this conversation, this example, sets the context really well. How do we determine the reliability of the answers provided by the LLM, right? So for my question comes from the perspective of understanding the vagueness of reliability when it comes to especially ethical values, right? So for example, you gave the example of cricket, right? Cricket is fair enough. You're predicting something which is very low, the predicting scores of a cricket match is low impact. So whenever it comes to something which is more gray in area, right? It's not black and white. Then how do you kind of solve this? And what are some of the steps that companies, enterprises that are building LLMs need to take to ensure that there is this trust built among the users as well as through fairness by the company? So,
Ethics is one of those things that is actually less of a problem, I believe, with such models. And the reason is the reason is ethics is largely still in the domain of humans. Say I program a bot to speak profanity. It will. And that's literally the instruction around it. If I program a bot to be gender biased, it will be. I mean, forget program. You just instruct a bot to do so. It will be. And we have seen that LLMs can be trained to follow instructions really well. So a big chunk of the ethical value, so to speak, entirely lies in how we guide these LLMs, or put another way, what use we put these LLMs to. And the reality is that so far, the same set of tools that we have used to evaluate the ethics of a decision making process can be applied here. Let's take security screening in the US. There was a time when security screening happened by people at the airports taking a call, some kind of profiling of a person, saying, let's do a random test of this person versus that person. Now, how do we know if that is, let's say, fair, if we take fairness as that aspect of ethics that we're considering right now? We look at the percentage of people that have been pulled out for random profiling and see how well distributed that is, if it's evenly distributed, if it's biased towards certain areas. Amazon did this systematically with their machine learning models that were picking resumes for hiring. They said, how often are we hiring women? And as a percentage, it was lower than men. It was because the data that they had fed in was from past candidates, many of whom were men. And the model was following that similar process. And now that they realized it, they corrected it. But what are the kinds of biases that the model has that Amazon is not aware of? That's a blind spot. It's unknown. So, put another way, the way in which we would evaluate the, let's say, fairness of an LLM is no different from the way in which we would evaluate the fairness of a machine learning model that we had before, or a simple statistical model, or a human model. Look at the output, see if that works. And that is a powerful technique, which is to say, I'm not concerned about what it's doing behind the scenes. If the output over time is sufficiently unbiased, then it's likely doing a good job. This kind of
Got it.
verification, if it can be automated, nothing like it. If there's enough data to do it, nothing like it. But the reality is, if it's a niche use, then it'll take a long time to figure this out. But when we're doing things at scale, there's going to be more data, it's going to happen faster.
Yeah, I think through this answer, one of the things that stuck to me is at fundamental level, whether to use the LLM at that for that use case is a very good this thing, right? So that probably we are in a lot of ways preventing unnecessary risks of LLMs saying or doing something wrong. And then at the same time, the second point that you made is also very relevant, right? So I think this conversation has been very helpful. Any closing thoughts around the discussion that we had?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out one thing. When we use LLMs, it's not just the power of the LLMs that are growing, it's our ability and knowledge of LLMs that's growing as well. There, for many years, I would just, when somebody asked a question, I would just search on Google, find the first result, copy paste the answer, and send it to them. In fact, quite often I still do that. I find that the first result just works. And it it always surprised me. Why is it that so many people can't do what is evident? Just search, find the answer, and get the result. I suspect that it's simply lack of familiarity. They haven't gotten it into their system that there is a way of getting knowledge different from asking someone. With LLMs, we are entering an era where the answer to pretty much any question can be found this way. So, as a closing thought, I'd say let LLMs evolve as fast as they want. But if we evolve along with the LLMs, learning how to leverage them, we have a powerful tool, and B, less risk of being left behind.
Fantastic. On that note, thank you so much, Anand, for making time for this interview. It was a very insightful this thing. It's very interesting to hear perspectives from both sides, technologists as well as ethicists, to discuss on topics such as trust. And this was one of those conversations. Thank you again.
Pleasure talking to you.